Welcome to Shooting the Space, the rocket photography podcast where you can get a front row seat to everything you want to know about capturing photos of launches and landings.
Falcon 9 startup.
Go for launch.
Vehicle supersonic.
Booster shutdown.
Stage separation confirmed.
Side boosters transonic. And stage 1 launch photos closed out.
T-minus 15 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Well, hey guys, welcome to Shooting the Space, a new podcast about everything rocket photography. I'm your co-host, Erik Kuna, joined by none other than John Kraus. So, John, how's it going?
Your other co-host. Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm wonderful now that I'm back in Tampa and not on the road for 17 hours, right?
We were on the road a long time there.
Yes, we were.
Yeah, but it was worth it.
But yeah, so we wanted to throw this this podcast together because we get asked, we were driving and talking about this, and we get asked a lot about everything to do with rocket photography. And we're like, you know what? I'm sure people would just enjoy just hearing about rockets and how we do what we do, maybe even also hearing from other people in the industry, which we'll get to in later episodes, just hearing people's perspectives on it. But before we get started, I think this first episode, what we really wanted to focus on is how did we get started, and also just the genre of rocket photography and what it's all about. So maybe, John, if you wanted to start how you got started, how you got into this.
Yeah, so first off, two things. I think in a world where everyone has a podcast, this is actually a podcast that might shine insight on something that not a lot of people hear about. So I'm excited to bring some behind the scenes looks at what we do. And also, I was going to say, we kind of have these conversations whenever we see each other. So I think it'll be good to have these conversations published and shared with people that will enjoy them and learn from them. So I've been doing launch photography, actually photography in general, for just under 5 years now. I started when I was a freshman in high school, and I pretty much on a whim bought my first DSLR camera. And about a month after that, there was a rocket launch. And because I grew up on the coast, on the Space Coast rather, I grew up watching these launches. So it just seemed like the right thing to shoot. So the first launch I ever shot was in February 2015. The Falcon 9 launch of Discover. And after that, I just quickly started to enjoy shooting these launches, and it became an obsession and a drive. And now I'm doing it professionally full time.
Yeah, awesome. And that's kind of, the similar story with me. Obviously, you've got me, or I've got you by a couple decades, right?
Decades, yeah.
So yeah, definitely, I got you. But similar stories there. Not being from the Space Coast, but being from Tampa, where I got into it after I saw the first booster land and actually land successfully. I was always into it growing up. You're just always into the space program. Being from Florida and actually seeing it out of your backyard, you get into it. And then when I saw that booster land, I really said, I got to be part of this, and I got to, what can I be a part of? And, me, my background being in photography and in video, that's something I've been doing for quite a long time now, like about 20 years. So, it just was one of those things where it kind of was a natural progression to come over to rocket photography. I'd been shooting a lot of sports, a lot of stuff like that, travel, landscape, which I still do on occasion, but really rockets has become my main thing I shoot. And like both of us, I know, John, I know you shoot, lighthouses, landscapes, pretty much anything. So
yeah. So I've actually never asked you this. What prompted you to come across that first landing? Did you just come across a stream link? Did someone say, "Hey, check this out"?
You know what? So I've always been into it, like since I've always been into space, and I've always been into SpaceX specifically, all the way from Falcon 1. But it's when the booster landed that was my catalyst for I gotta be part of photographing this history, because
Yeah.
I know you and me, we've talked about this. When you see those boosters land, right, and they come down to the ground, like that process is just, it's so amazing to see especially with your own eyes.
Yeah.
And when you see that and you see that happening, you're like, oh, this is it's mesmerizing, and it's transcending. It kind of transcends a lot of things. I had a friend, from the UK. He was over here recently, and it was actually, I was at a launch, and he was in the area, and he said, "Hey, where should I go?" And I told him, "Oh, go to Jetty Park, go out on the beach. It'll be beautiful. You'll have a great time." And I saw, because I said the booster's landing, you're going to see a great shot of the booster landing. It was at night, and afterwards, what was very interesting about his words that he used, what he said, "Wow, Erik, I can't believe we did that."
Yeah.
And it's a really thing of we, that
Mhm.
there's a collective we when it comes to space, that we start to lose our borders. We start to lose our differences. We kind of put those things aside, because we'll always joke at each other about, like, the UK does this, or America does this. But, when it came to that was the first time I remember us, kind of saying those words. So I thought that was really interesting. And that's really always kept me intrigued about, space and the space program is, just getting us out to adventure. And then at the end of the day, that's really what I like to do, is I like to share my knowledge of photography. I like to tell people about it. I mean, that's what I do full time. So, I work with a company. That's what we do. Kelby One, we educate people on photography. So it's just in my DNA of wanting to share and wanting to help and doing that kind of stuff. So, when you really get down to it, I think our segue now is just talking about the common misconceptions. Because, one of the things we wanted to do with this podcast is really talk about those things that sometimes a lot of people don't talk about and don't give insight to. So, what would you say is the number one common misconception you get?
It's hard to pin one down, but I think one of the biggest ones would be to touch on these close-up images that we capture of launches. We are not physically standing where our cameras are to capture these pictures. We set up what we call remote cameras anywhere from 6 to 12, maybe even 24 hours ahead of the launch. And they operate on their own. I primarily use sound triggers that plug into the cameras. So they hear the sound of the rocket, and then they fire images rapidly at liftoff. So these cameras operate at distances where humans would be severely injured or perhaps even killed. So it's a really interesting challenge in this genre of photography. You're not there to adjust things on the fly. So you have to do all this preparation beforehand to ensure that your camera is going to survive battery wise, to ensure that your lens isn't going to get dewed over if it's a night launch, ensure that your camera is not going to overheat. At some launch pads, we're staking down our tripods with literally tent stakes to make sure that they're not tipping over from the rocket or wind. So it's just a really unique challenge that I don't think photographers outside of this genre really see.
Right. And as you were talking there, I kind of brought up some images just behind the scenes shots of, these are some of our cameras. Like this is obviously this is a Falcon launch from 39A, but you can see like there's cameras there where a lot of times we have, the reason you'll see a bag on them is not for the rocket going to melt the camera or something like that. The bag's on there for weather sealing. It's really because we're out there in the elements. We're leaving our cameras out there for days at a time, and then you can see right next to, some people go as far as to create boxes, and wrap their cameras in boxes. Sometimes you're staking them down. A lot of times I know that we kind of debate this, like I don't stake down as much as I used to. And
I can say the same.
And
with more and more launches, I stake less.
Yeah, and I think really at the end of the day, it has to do with weather more than the rocket.
Absolutely.
If
In
there's
most
a
cases, I
storm
agree.
coming in, because we'll get these storms in Florida where they'll kick up, you get those 40-mile-per-hour gusts like right
Yeah.
away. And that's where a lot of times where I'll stake down, not so much for the rocket. But I think that's a big misconception is that, if you do this, your cameras are going to get blown around or knocked around. How many cameras have you ever had get damaged?
I'd say I've had maybe 6 lenses damaged from a variety of sources. And then, funnily enough, I've shot about 80 launches. I've probably set remotes for half of those, give or take 15. The only time I've lost cameras is from rain damage.
Yep.
I've never had a rocket do anything to a camera where the camera itself was not functional.
Yeah. And I'm the same. Yeah.
I think it's worth touching on another slight misconception is the level of autonomy that we have as the press. For example, with weather, if there is a storm incoming and we're scheduled to set up cameras 2 hours before that storm arrives, we can't ask the launch provider to let us set up later. Obviously, the launch operations supersede our coverage as press. So if there's going to be rain after our setup, we have to prepare for that. And it makes for an interesting challenge.
Right. And that's why a lot of times we're doing that, where we're covering the cameras, we're adding even hand warmers a lot of times and dew heaters. Sometimes the other reason we would add them is to burn off any rain that gets on the front element. I
really wonder if the Hot Hands company thinks that there's something going on in Florida.
I know,
with how many people order these hand warmers. They have to think it's something weird.
Well, I could tell you that I think I luck out living in Tampa because I think our distribution center for Amazon has them in stock when usually your guys' distribution center has them out of stock.
Really? I've never noticed. I buy them in bulk, so I don't have to buy them.
Yeah, I buy them in bulk too.
I buy them in huge boxes.
Yeah, you buy them in those. Yeah, and they come from Amazon in that huge box.
Yep.
So, yeah. Well, that's what we should probably, if this goes any farther, we'll get Hot Hands to sponsor the podcast.
Yeah,
right?
Please.
Yeah.
Are there any other misconceptions you think we could touch on? Because I just thought of one if you don't have one.
Well, I think the other thing is I do agree with the shooting from afar. That I think the misconception is when people see shots, they think they're from afar when they're from the pad. But I think the opposite too is there's also shots that are kind of like in between shots that we'll get.
Yes.
That we'll purposely want to get a little farther from the pad in order to get. So not all the time are we wanting to set up really close to the pad. You might want to kind of get in that middle area with it.
Quarter mile.
Yeah, exactly.
Or so. Yeah.
And then sometimes at that point, you're actually not relying on sound, which is one thing that we didn't really touch on. But all these cameras are the main trigger element for all these cameras is sound. So we're using
it's reliable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's always there.
A rocket goes off, it's going to make a loud boom. Hopefully a controllable boom in the right direction, right?
Yes. Yes.
But like we're using a MyOps trigger or we're using other types of triggers, but usually when you start getting a distance away, that sound takes a while to travel to you. So that's another thing when you're watching a rocket launch or photographing a rocket launch, you see it way before you hear it.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one thing that we have to factor in with these cameras. When we start getting too far away, the
rocket will be gone.
Yeah, we're going to have to.
Before the camera fires.
So what do you do in those situations? I think we do the same thing.
Rely on timers.
Yep.
Yeah, which can be tricky if the launch isn't an instantaneous window. But I have had a few instances where I have used timers and I just had to sacrifice and tell the camera to only shoot a frame every 2 seconds. So if my frame here is the camera frame, you might only get 1 or 2 pictures, but that's a sacrifice you have to make.
Exactly. What was your other one that you had? Misconception.
I think some people think that if you have press access, you'll always want to utilize that. We've both had a multitude of of photo shoots for launches where we'd rather be offsite. I know I like to utilize a lot of the scenery that the Space Coast has to offer, and you've done the same for sure.
Yep.
So part of that comes with I take pride in knowing that I can get a good photo from a location that quite literally anyone could go set up at. I think it's fun to look for those creative shots that can be had from public locations.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Actually, my favorite shot, or a couple favorite shots. My favorite shot of yours is offsite. My favorite shot of mine is offsite.
Which one of mine are you thinking of?
I like your one that you were in the river.
Okay.
Where you got into the river.
Yeah.
So,
I don't think many other people would do that. So.
Yeah. Well, and that's really honestly sometimes what we've got to think about is where would other people not go? What would other people not do? Which, I mean, I know in the next podcast that we're talking about, we were going to talk about our shots up in Wallops Island, Virginia for the launch that just happened recently. And that's really what you have to start thinking is you're going to be with 50 other people in the same spot. How are you going to differentiate your photo?
Yeah.
And that's a big thing. And, that's, I think sometimes while the pad shots are awesome, there's so much that you can do creatively off-site, especially at night, with the streaks and stuff like that. You can really start getting some interesting, or if you start getting into the twilight times, which, that's my jam. That's my favorite is the twilight launches.
I think for off-site shoots, you're right. There's definitely more opportunities for those non-day launches. So basically twilight and night, because if you're watching a Falcon 9 launch from 20 miles away, there's still a shot to be had. If you're a space fan, you probably know that the Falcon 9 rocket doesn't use solid rocket boosters. And solid rocket boosters are what provide that smoke trail. So if you do a wide shot from far away for a launch that has a smoke trail, compositionally, the rocket and its trail is going to take up a larger portion of the frame. But for, say, a Falcon 9 launch, you're really only getting a little speck in the frame. But with a night launch, you can do those long exposure streak shots where you do get that trail across the frame. So basically what I'm getting at is you can shoot night launches from farther away than you can day launches and still get nice results. So for people that don't have press access, or I'd say press people that want to get more creative shots, don't just limit yourself to shooting as close as possible. There are a variety of public locations that are decently close to the launch pads, but some of my favorite offsite shoots are from farther away than you might think. Yeah.
And here's some, like, this is that shot I was talking about with John. This is one where you're in this river, right? You're physically in that like river.
15 miles away from the launch pad. And
exactly.
I took that photo neck deep in the river. Yeah.
And this is what we're talking about. And then like over here, we're
to
talking
be fair,
about
that one was on site, but same premise.
Yep. But that's what it can work. I mean, some of these are on site, some of these are off site. This is at Jetty Park.
Beautiful.
This is at Jetty Park.
It is.
That's on site. Oh,
by the way, it'd probably be worth mentioning because there will be people that it's a podcast that are listening audio only, but we will have a video version where you guys can see the images we're referencing.
But basically the premise being you can, and that's what John was talking about here. Like you look at this shot, when you have an Atlas V or something with a solid rocket booster, or I should say motor in this case, solid rocket motor, it's going to create that smoke trail in the sky even during the day, right?
Which creates a sort of compositionally, there's more visual weight.
Correct.
To a rocket with a trail behind it. It really ties in that the rocket's coming from the ground and up into the sky versus here. There is a bit of an exhaust trail, but it's not defined like the smoke.
But the point being is if that gets up 30% more in the frame, if that gets up out of the frame taller, you're going to have nothing to kind of bring it to the ground. It's going to look like it's just floating out there. So you see,
if you look at that shot, you start to get into that territory. Yeah.
Right. And well, that's why the framing is here because if it gets too high, there's no context for it anymore.
Yep.
So, yeah, there we go. So, and we just wanted to, again, just have these casual conversations about this stuff, because I think we get asked all the time these kind of things, and speaking of things getting asked, a lot of people ask about like the most rewarding part of the process. So
I remember we had this discussion on the drive
yes
up, I think. Yeah.
Yes. So what would you say is your most rewarding part of the process?
I think so. A lot of photographers compare the remote camera pickup to Christmas morning.
Yeah.
And I think it's the perfect analogy, because for me, using bags, you're quite literally unwrapping a bag from your camera. And you either see a present on the back of the screen, which is usable images of the launch, or you get coal, which is a black screen or nothing on the screen or a dead camera. So I think that kind of, you have the immediate relief that it launched, and then you have that hour, 2 hours, even a day, depending on who's doing what to when we pick up the cameras, of just anxiety. And then you have that immediate satisfaction, or in some cases devastation, when you see nothing on the back of the screen. So that immediate seeing the results and knowing I'm going to have content is just a rush.
Yeah, and I'm pretty much the same way. There's a couple things, like when I see the rocket, actually when I see that orange yellowy glow on the horizon, that's really like a rewarding time for me, because that tends to be a couple things. I know, okay, my remote cameras are probably going off right now, so it's going to be Christmas soon. I'm seeing this rocket lift off, which is amazing. Plus, I get to go home.
You do, and you live a little farther than I do from
live
the Cape,
a little farther, and I look at it like, okay, because people don't really understand too that all the prep that goes into setting up these launches, and I'm sure we'll get into that. We could probably have a whole episode about all the prep that goes into just one launch. But that's where you're doing all this prep, you're going all this work, and then you see this rocket lift off, and you're like, and not only that, it's just a special moment, and especially if you see it land, like that is just like it's very the adrenaline just starts pumping. But then me on the other side, I really like the post. I really like taking because there's a lot of times with my photos, I will intentionally shoot something with the idea of post-processing it. So, and I know you kind of do the same thing with a lot of our settings and stuff like that, where we're exposing shots a certain way for the end results, that we're not always perfectly exposing, the scene. We might be underexposing the scene to bring out the detail and the flames and the shadows.
And I think that's sort of a skill learned over time. Maybe not necessarily simply shooting at flame settings, but rather, I know we've talked about when we first started, we would shoot really wide just so we could get a shot.
Get shots. And then we get multiple, and then we think, oh, we're going to get multiple shots. And that was like the worst advice starting out. Like I would never give anybody that advice.
As we sort of hone our skills over dozens of launches, for the most part, I think when we're setting up a camera, we're going for one shot. We know where we want the rocket in the frame. We know how the smoke's going to be, and we know how other compositional elements in the frame will interact with the rocket, so to speak. And we're going for a pre-visualized shot, which when we talk more about planning in the future, we can go into more depth. But
no, totally. We are going after, with all of our cameras, one shot. You might get a second shot where it would be
you are surprised sometimes.
You might get like the flame detail, the flame coming down, and like all the drama of the smoke plume, or you might get something earlier in your frame where it just looks cool with the rocket and where it's positioned. But usually all these shots we were going after that one frame.
And to touch on one thing you said earlier when you were talking about the instant relief when you see that fireball on the horizon, I think it's really interesting to note, and this may be obvious, but I'd say the overwhelming majority of our remote camera shots are all captured within the first 3 to 10 seconds of flight.
It's probably 3.
Yeah.
Probably 3.
So as soon as the rocket clears the tower, and sometimes we do shoot wider, we do
Sometimes,
wider
yeah.
streaks from the pad, but like if you're watching the live stream, as soon as you see that ignition, count to 3 and think about all the launch photos you're going to see from that launch, at least through close-ups, were probably taken in that really short time span, which I think is just so cool, because when you're watching that launch from afar, as soon as the rocket clears the tower, you're still shooting your handheld telephoto shots, but all your remotes have fired. It's just something interesting to consider if you've never thought about that.
Well, and 2, when you realize how fast then the rocket is moving, when you think about this multiple story tower, multiple story rocket building is just launching out of this pad. And, some of these smaller rockets too, they'll be gone in less time than that.
You blink and they're gone.
Yeah.
You have to start thinking about if your remotes are going to fire in time.
Yeah, and that's another thing that we have to consider with some of this stuff is, when it camps out, that's why the nice part about certain rockets is given their characteristics. And that's one of the things that then we get into, we study a lot of times is what does this rocket do? Like we just shot the Antares rocket. The nice part about that one is it does an operation in the beginning that starts it up, and it kind of wakes up your cameras, gets them going. And I can tell you, like that launch, I've got all the way from it starting all the way clearing the tower.
Yep.
Where you'll have other launches where
you don't get it till
it goes, and you've got those first few frames. I remember certain engine shots going after, and it's very hard. Like this one is a good one in particular that I went after this shot right here a couple times because it's hard to get that Falcon 9.
I'm guessing
that Falcon 9 rocket to be in front of these rainbirds at that moment, because a lot of times that sound won't travel that far that quickly, and I'll have to mess around with my settings to make sure that I'm getting that shot that I wanted, because I had another one where I was framing up this and the rocket's already way up out here on the edge of the frame. Well, that's not what I wanted it. So, sometimes you got to go after it again.
I'm sure you've done this to some effect, but I will find a previous launch video. I'll look at photos from the same rocket, same pad, knowing where those cameras were placed. And I will line up my cameras, or maybe I don't do all my cameras at once, usually not. But I will be watching this video. I'll look at where the first frame was from that previous launch. And then I'll watch the video and then start shooting with my camera, just sitting at my desk, when that rocket reaches that point. And I know when my camera buffer is going to fill up.
I was about to say, that's what I do that for buffer.
Frame. Yeah, so for people that don't know, your buffer is, or when we say when your buffer fills up, most of the cameras we use, they'll shoot a certain number of frames, and then the memory cards will kind of have to catch up to write those files. And then the frame rate will slow down. So we may get, and then it goes, so we have to plan for that. So it's just another challenge, another thing we have to think about.
Yeah, and a lot of times too, because we're shooting in RAW, that'll fill your buffer up faster. Yeah. So obviously you can get away with a little bit more with JPEG, but then what we're sacrificing in the range, it just, I'll a lot of times do that, like exactly what John's saying. I'm timing it to go, I want to make sure my bulk of my shots are going to be in that range where it's not going to fill up my buffer if I'm going for a certain shot. That's why I'll actually adjust sensitivities so it won't actually trigger too early, because I don't want it to fill up the buffer, because I need it to be a little higher before I actually am going to get that shot. So you're kind of like, it's exactly what John's saying. You're watching other launches, and then we've even had it now where vehicles are starting to change, like the first Falcon Heavy versus the last Falcon Heavy, the timings are different now. Yeah. Because the rockets are a little bit different. So even though we can study these things, it's very fluid. It's still moving around. There's just still a fluid target.
Which keeps it interesting for sure.
Yeah.
But there's times where I'm even willingly setting my cameras to a slower frame rate so those buffers don't fill up too early. So I was talking earlier about how sometimes when using timers, I'll be shooting 1 or 2 frames a second. There's times where my cameras are close and I'm doing that anyway.
Yeah.
So we're
so
always
you don't fill up
studying.
the buffer. Yeah, I actually will use that a lot of times where I'll set up a custom function to adjust my frame rate so I know the buffer will last however long I need it to. So instead of, like on my 5D Mark III, I believe it is, instead of it filling up really quick, I'll drop the continuous low speed down to like 4 frames per second, just so I know that will carry me through the whole frame of what I'm getting at or what I need in my shot. Then I'm actually studying that to know, hey, my buffer will not fill up with this camera.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all these little things. Kind of continuing on with the struggles and the difficulties here. What about failure? So these things don't always work, right?
Yeah.
People think they always work because they see shots, but
we often, I know us in particular, us too, we're setting up 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe even more cameras a launch. And if you're seeing us, and if you're seeing us upload again 4, 5, 6, 7 plus angles, you might not realize that we actually set up one more camera than that didn't fire. And what's interesting about failures with remote camera photography is a lot of the time we don't know why it failed. Again, we're not there during the launch to operate those cameras. So when we come back and pick up those cameras and there's nothing on the memory card, we don't know what happened a lot of the time, which makes it tricky to diagnose what went wrong. Sometimes this is kind of funny, sadistic, if you will. The cameras will fire, but they'll be due on the lens, and it's like you're looking through a shower door or something, or like through a kaleidoscope, which, funnily enough, you did on purpose once.
Yeah, I did on purpose.
That's another
once.
Story.
Yeah.
But yeah, sometimes you don't get shots at all. Sometimes you get shots that you bumped the focus ring while you're setting up, or you're shooting through dew. So there are failures.
Right. So then I think what ends up happening, and I know that we've got to that point where you end up mitigating your failures. So what you're doing is, we'll say, like we just had that happen where somebody's like, "Why are you putting dew heaters on your camera?" And it's like, I'm just mitigating my failure. The $1, it's not worth the $1 to have that shot possibly be ruined. I mean, we were just at a launch where the dew point was 3 degrees off an hour and a half before. I just not willing to risk for the $1 because I've been burnt before. Or, focus. I know certain lenses, I got to tape my focus. I got to make sure my focus is taped down and it's not going to move or wiggle with the vibrations. Or certain other cameras I know, I'll be better shooting that at this sharpness level or this f-stop because it's going to be sharper. So you're just starting to mitigate and going, I'm just going to put the chips in my favor, and kind of stack the chips, if you will. So, and
what's great is when you can identify the failure, that gives you another thing to work against the next time. For example, with dew, if you're starting out and you don't know that you should be using hand warmers, and then you get dewed out, to use hand warmers the next time. Yeah. So it's always a learning experience.
But I'm always the one who I love to tell people about it, and not that a lot of people. Well, and I don't want to I'm not preaching buy hand warmers, but if somebody asks me, I'm going to tell them that I do it every time, and here's why. Because I just don't want people to fail. I mean, I've failed, and I don't think that. I mean, if we just learn from each other's failures, we could have a better world. So, I mean, hey, I put the dew heaters on because then I don't have that disappointment. Because I've seen so many people back on the bus. They get that image back on the bus, and they're
they think
why
they got
is this? Yeah, because they see it, but then they're like, why is this milky or hazy.
Yeah.
And then they start zooming in, and then they're like, I can't really see anything. And then they're taking on the computer and they're putting that dehaze slider up to 100 and they still can't see it.
There's nothing.
And then you feel bad showing them your shot that's like completely clean.
Yeah, that happened at Demo 1. I think a lot of people got do that because there was a kind of a rainstorm.
There was a rainstorm right before,
Mm-hmm.
and then there was also that we were at the dew point. So rainstorm, dew point, the people who had dew heaters and hand warmers were pretty good.
Yeah.
The people that didn't were gone. I mean, their images were basically just a big old, looked like you were shooting San Francisco fog.
Huh.
Yeah.
And to play off that, this isn't to say I don't experiment compositionally, but I am very hesitant to experiment technologically. I was using an older trigger for the longest time, and I was reluctant to switch to the MyOps trigger, even though a lot of people said they were reliable, because I knew what worked. And even on the launches that aren't as big in the media, I still care about my photos, and I didn't want to risk switching to something that was for me unproven. So
it's a good point.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm reluctant to try new things with the cameras. Now, compositionally, it's different.
So then we could get into the topic of, so that'll be a segue into the, I think our final topic there that we had on our outline, and that is when you get down to how do you differentiate your shot? Because I agree with you. I'm totally in that camp is I use what is reliable for the gear. I have cameras that I know will work. I have settings that I know will work. I have like a formula there, and it's like, why mess with that formula? The thing I really want to mess with is the framing, is the composition, is the basically the frame in which I'm capturing, because that's really what photography is all about. It's not about, is my photo technically accurate?
Yes.
Is my photo, are my highlights perfect? Are my shadows perfect? Is this perfectly in focus? It's not about that. It's really about the emotion, the mood of this launch. Yeah. And that's really the thing. It's the gesture. I mean, we were talking about that. If we see all the time, we're shooting and we look, I remember John and I look at each other like, there's nothing here. I don't know. We just, let's move to another location. There's nothing here. So,
and I think we talk about this a lot, but again, this podcast is going to be a medium for us to share a lot of the things we talk about often. A photograph of a cool thing is not necessarily a good photograph. So I think a lot of times, not just other photographers, ourselves included, we get photos of launches that we say, it's a photo of a rocket, but it's not a great photo. Snapshot versus photograph, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's a hard one, because that's where I think we've got to that point a little bit where when people really like a photo, when people really go crazy about a photo, they're not necessarily always saying like, I love your photo, it's so great. They're saying, oh, that subject is really cool.
Yes.
Like, oh my gosh, a rocket launching. I mean, how can that not be cool?
Yeah. Everything we shoot, kind of by definition, it's a rocket launch, is exciting. It's
awesome.
We're kind of always looking for ways to convey exciting subjects in appealing photography ways, so to speak.
So how do we, and that's another thing of, kind of dealing with the environments that we have to deal with. How do we differentiate shots? Because one thing I think people don't realize is a lot of times we have predetermined locations we can shoot in. Certain pads will have, you can set up from this cone to this cone, and that area might be 40 feet. 30 feet. And then everybody else has got to fit within that box. How do you deal with that?
Well, if I knew, my shots would be a lot better. I mean, this is something we talk about every launch, every time we see each other. I think it just comes with constantly experimenting. There's a lot of times where I set up a shot and I don't know if it's going to be cool, but I'm going to try. it's really hard to elaborate on this without any specific examples, but our colleague Trevor Mallman did a lens ball shot, which you've
Mm-hmm.
done before,
Yep.
but he did it in a slightly different way. And this
Yep.
is just a
Yep.
totally random example, but a lot of it comes with experimenting because we don't know what's going to work until we try it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's sometimes what it is too, is like you were just saying, is Trevor in that instance, and why I even experimented with it and why I continue to experiment. And like, even like you were talking about, is put a kaleidoscope in front of your lens. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the reason you might do that stuff, or the reason I do that stuff, is because I go, well, I want to have something that's a differentiating factor. I want something that could be cool. Now, sometimes royal failures. Sometimes
Yeah.
they're like, oh my gosh, this is so dumb, but other times it's really, really cool,
Yeah.
so it's just kind of finding that, I found a lot of changing my perspectives, changing my angles, putting my cameras in places, in bushes, or framing up stuff around my shots, like you've done before too, framing up kind of nature in your shot.
Yes. One of my favorites.
Really kind of like to simplify the pads, because another thing a lot of people don't realize is a lot of these are active construction sites.
Literally. Yeah.
Like all these pads are being improved and improved and improved upon constantly. Well, as you see, like if you live in Florida and you drive on our roads are constantly being, repaired or new construction. It's not the prettiest when there's construction going on. So a lot of these pads have construction, so you have to work within those boundaries. So a lot of times you have to frame shots intentionally where you're removing these distracting elements,
Yeah.
and
And
kind
not
of
only
simplifying it.
not only do those distractions affect the shots visually, but sometimes they physically limit where we can set up.
Mhm.
There was a time, I don't remember exactly when, but for a couple launches at Launch Pad 40, SpaceX's launch pad, one of them, we had about half the setup space because there was ongoing construction that was limiting
Yeah.
where we could set up our cameras.
Yeah. And yeah, there's just it was a very tight space. Now, it's opened up a little bit more, but you also don't know if you show up for another launch, it might be back down or smaller, it might be a
Yeah.
new area, which is a lot of times why we plan as much as we can so we can be fluid.
Mhm.
Or at least I know both of us do that, where, we're
Yeah.
studying apps like photo pills to know, like when we show up at the pad, we know where the sun's going to be at launch. We know if it's night, if there's a moon going to be in the shot, if, what are the elements that are going to happen around the photo. So when we show up, we know where we can plan to set up,
Yeah.
mattering on what our freedoms are going to be at that launch.
And I know we're going to talk about the recent Antares launch later or in a different episode, but I had a shot where I tried something that I've never seen anyone try before. I was trying it for the first time, and the camera didn't even fire. And
Yeah.
I don't know why the camera didn't fire. So I'm going to try it again next week at the Starlink launch, and I'm not going to share what those plans are. You know what they are, but
Yeah.
I'm not going to share them until I do the shot successfully.
Right.
And then another shot at Wallops, again, we'll elaborate later, but I tried something that I've never seen anyone do before. And not to toot my own horn too much, it was pretty obvious, but just no one thought to try it. So
Yeah.
sometimes those new shots are just staring right at you.
Yeah,
And
it's
again,
just
we'll talk
thinking
about that
outside
later.
it's thinking outside that box a little bit.
Yeah.
Which is another thing. I mean, we can get into. I mean, I don't put my cameras in a box because I just can't be in a box. I have to move around. I have to change. I have to be fluid, and I need that freedom. So I think our last question here for this episode was at what point did we ever realize, or did you realize that you had a lot more to learn and master than you originally thought?
I'd say it's hard to pin an exact launch because every launch or most launches will have little things we learn.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe after 2 years of shooting, one of which was as media, I got
Okay.
credentialed fairly quickly, but I'd say it took a year, maybe 10 media launches to realize like, whoa, like you don't have all the shots yet. you haven't shot all these rockets in all the light conditions you can. You failed in ways that you didn't know you could fail, which, to be honest, kind of has inspired me to keep shooting.
Yeah.
But I'd say maybe after about 2 years of photography, when I started to think that I got it, so to speak, that was right around when my work started to get picked up. And I think, as much as I don't want this to happen, when you do get a lot of good feedback on your work, you might shy away from realizing that it could get better.
Right.
And that's a whole nother topic. But I did learn that after about 2 years, I realized I could grow a lot more. And I don't know about you, because you were already...
I was already kind of doing it. I think when we apply it specifically to this, I think it honestly is when you start experiencing those failures. Because at first, you're doing, like you were talking about, I think we all started, at first you're going like, I'm going to go wide, I'm going to get a bunch of...
just get a shot. Just get a shot.
And if it fires, as long as it fires and it works, like you're happy at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the turning point is when you realize that there's so much more to it, that framing up these shots that we get where that rocket, everybody looks at it like, oh, you were so lucky. But it's like, no, that's exactly what I designed it to do. Like that was planning. That's hard work. Like that's a lot of effort goes into those little things. And I think when you get to that point where you're planning out shots and then you get dewed out, and you got it all fogged up, or you bump the focus and then you realize like, man, I did luck out on other things. Now I'm trying to do stuff intentional, and I need to get way better at this. Because then what happens is you get good at the camera settings. And like we were talking about, you get good at knowing your camera, knowing your gear, all that stuff. Because if you get to that point, then all that's left is the real photography stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
you got to learn how to do it technically first before you can do it too artistically, so to speak.
Right.
And that's not to say we have all the technical parts nailed down, because sometimes our cameras don't fire.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just a constant improving. And I wanted to add on to that. This is one reason I'm so excited for this podcast, because I think we could devote entire episodes to talking about 2 camera angles and all the planning that goes into that.
Yeah.
I'm just excited for a medium to be able to share some of the planning that goes into these shots.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's probably, we've gone over what we said we would do for an episode, but I think from here we're going to just start recording some other episodes as launches come up, as topics come up. I know that one that we probably will get into fairly soon, which is always the question that comes up, is credentialing. That's a big one for people.
Yeah,
and understanding that process.
Yes.
Because I think that probably will end up being a conversation unto itself, because I think that people think, oh, I could just, I'm good enough, I can just get credentials. And it's like, I think there's so much more that we could help you to get better at before you get to that point, so you're not upset with your results.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big thing.
I think, and this isn't to diminish anyone's efforts, but I think sometimes people do try to jump in too quickly. Yeah, and I think I might even have. I had only shot like 8 launches before I started as press, and to be frank, I think that I might have jumped in too soon, but I had the opportunity.
I would say the exact same thing, and that's where, again, if I could have somebody that would have just helped me out in the beginning and just kind of given me some pointers, I would have loved that. So I think that's one of the things we want to do here, is just kind of pay it forward.
Yeah. And it's difficult because you're chasing that opportunity, and you're not going to say no because it's so exciting. But that's a topic for another episode.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining us for this podcast. We're just talking casually about rocket photography. So
hopefully it wasn't too rocky.
Yeah,
it's my first time hosting a podcast, so I know you have more experience than I, but hopefully we learn as we go.
I'm not that great at it, that's for sure. So
we'll learn as we go.
It's not my forte. I like taking pictures of rockets.
Same here. Yeah. I think that could be our kind of tagline. I like taking pictures of rockets.
There you go. All right, guys. Well, we will be back next week. I think we're going to be talking Antares and the launch up there, all breaking that whole thing down.
Yeah.
See you guys.
See you guys then.